So, hi. In this first session for tonight, I'm very happy to have Scott Greenberg join us. I'm Negisa Balluku, Senior Bankruptcy Litigation Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Scott is a partner in Gibson Dunn's New York office, where he is the global chair of the firm's Business Restructuring and Reorganization Practice Group. He's also a member of the firm's executive committee. I'm particularly excited to have Scott here for his depth of experience in liability management exercises, and in particular, his unique insight into the ever-so-elusive cooperation agreements. Scott, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's jump right in. So much of the lender strategy in the LME space today seems to stem from this interplay between showing a united front to fight against loose documents, building this critical mass of creditors to do that, but also being able to preserve some flexibility to do non-prorata deals, for example. So I want to start by asking you, what are some of the considerations lenders face today to balance those goals? And as you do that, as you get into the details, I was also hoping you could describe the trajectory of your involvement in the world of LMEs and co-ops.
Sure. I would say and obviously I spend most of my time representing lenders, the environment has gotten much more complex. The chest has become three-dimensional, and to your point, going back in time, and I think back in my own career to the days of like the J. Crew IP drop-down, when those transactions were few and far between, and lenders being very reactive, and litigation being maybe their only avenue to fight the transactions. I think the world has developed, the lender community has gotten much more sophisticated over the years, and despite the fact that unfortunately I don't think the documents have really changed, to your point, they're still very loose, so to speak, with room and flexibility, and you've had sponsors and their advisors get much more creative in terms of how they're going to approach the capital structure when they have a problem. Lenders have had to find other ways besides just relying on the document in terms of protecting themselves. So, yes, the idea is in cooperation agreements, which you've mentioned, is lenders get together, they act as a united front. But also, I mean, some people just have more skin in the game in very large capital structures. And so, making numbers up, like $1 billion term loan, someone that owns $150 million may be thinking about their opportunity set very differently from someone that owns $5 million. And so while the intent obviously is to, in the first instance, unite as lenders and work together, and that is the guiding light, I think the reality is, as these deals get negotiated, just like in old school bankruptcies where you'd have backstop fees and things like that in connection to the dip, that there's some flexibility for the larger guys to do better, to put it simply. And that's the tension that's balanced. I think it's gotten better over time, meaning, LMEs 5 or 6 years ago were a little bit more truly use the word non-pro-rata. I think of that as people get to participate, people don't get to participate. Nowadays, everyone gets to participate.
So how often do you see lenders having to make decisions about participating in one of these co-ops that have this sort of different flavors, whether there's tiered or carve out, or not doing a co-op at all, and I guess to go along with that, you just mentioned it now as to what the different perspectives between the larger versus smaller lenders and how that plays out in the space.
Sure. Look, I think, and we've been involved in a lot of cooperation agreements on the lender side, obviously. I think the reality is, as the landscape has changed, the feasibility of using a cooperation agreement also changes, meaning it's not a one-size-fits-all environment. It's not the first thing, I think, despite market perception, that we talk about when we formulate a group. There's a million factors that play into it. Is the sponsor engaging? Does the sponsor have a history of doing aggressive transaction? Is this a white shoe sponsor who never does these type of things? So we really don't have much to worry about because it's not in their DNA set. I think from the larger lenders versus the smaller lenders, if you're a larger lender and you own 10 or 15% of a loan, the reality is there's really not a deal away from you through the structure. They're going to need you to participate, the sponsor, the company, the owner, if it's public. So I think you probably have a little bit less downside than a smaller lender who may or may not be necessary to facilitate a transaction. So these are issues we discuss at the outset. Sometimes it's obvious. Altice France, it was obvious we needed a co-op. I have other situations where, including as recently as today, where I had a lender on one of my deals say, we should have a co-op here. I don't think we need one. So I think it's a debate that goes on. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. I don't know that any of us have a crystal ball that we're smart enough in hindsight to know whether or not it made sense. But I think most of them are judgment calls based on the facts.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about, to go in a bit more detail about potential drawbacks like liquidity about entering the co-ops, but I'm curious about your roles of law firms in general and in how they split between firms evaluating a borrower in distress, looking at the weak covenants, putting groups of lenders together versus having proactive lenders that come to you with this idea, or whether, and maybe there's a more organic way in which this group come together. So how does it play out?
Sure. I mean, the way it typically works is there's a large lender in the structure. Someone has a relationship with the institution. Either we identify things and say, hey, you have a bunch of exposure. If you looked at XYZ credit, just trade it off 10 points. It looks like it has some headwinds. And we start doing a doc analysis for one of our clients. Sometimes it's the inverse. The client comes into you and says, this is now on our watch list internally. Can you guys take a look at the docs and kind of give me the lay of the land and how you think this could play forward? And it usually starts with one or two lender conversation, and obviously it's usually a larger lender, someone with a lot of exposure, so they're focused on it. The way, at least in my experience, the way that then transgresses into a group is if you've done enough work for XYZ fund and it's topical, you say, look, I know the next 5 lenders on the Bloomberg, right? Do you mind if I start talking to them about it and sharing the analysis? And as long as your big guy says okay, then you start talking to a bunch of others, and then eventually, if there's something to do, that turns into a group. But that's the typical, at least in my experience, it's the typical way it happens. It's one big guy or two big guys that are institutional relationships with a lot of exposure that see something. And again, to the point of organizing early, this is usually pretty far away from a catalyst, right? It's looking at it early.
Right. So you were just talking before about co-ops and this process being a lot more inclusive now, moving away from what the winners versus losers of before. And this is a bit topic,
Depends.
but I am curious about the spread though, and I'm curious how. Do you think it's peaked, first of all? Do you see it narrowing in the future? Is there room for potential growth?
In terms of
the spread
spreads
in terms.
I'll stay away from specific deals.
Yeah, please.
What I would say is I think it has narrowed, generally speaking. And I'll stay away from my own cases, some of which are still in litigation. But if you think back to 2020, right, the CERTAs, the board riders, the tri-marks, true deals where there were participants and non-participants, right? That has shifted long before the Fifth Circuit decision. That had shifted more towards everyone gets a taste, as I say. And part of that, obviously, is to try to get the highest amount of participation, because if you think about it, if you have a maturity or something as part of this that you're trying to extend, and you have a huge stub, then you really haven't solved the problem. And part of it is reducing litigation, right? Lenders don't want it, the sponsor doesn't want it, the company doesn't want it. And so, as I always say, it's like art, not science, of how far can the big guys push the littler guys before people say enough's enough. We're going to fight you on this. And so I think there's been an attempt to get more to the middle, but I mean, there have been some deals that have printed in the last month with 25-point spreads. I mean, it's I don't think it's gone away.
Okay. You were sort of touching before about this, again, very large topic as far as the deal away and that potential and that risk. I'm curious, how realistic is, in your client's mind, the threat of private credit today?
So two different things. In my mind, private credit's obviously a real thing, and one of the biggest growing industries in our financial markets. But not, at least in my experience, the private credit solution is typically viewed as a positive, which is like, I have deals, private credit comes and refinances us out, my guys get par, everyone's happy. I think what you mean is the third-party dollars, which is different, at least in my mind, different than private credit. It's a risk. It's something that's threatened in every deal. It's something that I could tell you on a sponsor-by-sponsor basis. I can handicap, because I've just done enough of it, I can handicap which ones are kind of full of it and which ones will really do that, and you need to really put a value on that risk away. It's interesting. I have a lot of friends and clients that have pockets of capital that are devoted to the third-party financing. And I ask them sometimes, I'm like, I don't know how you spend all this time doing it, because 99% of the time the deal goes back to the lenders, and you just wind up being a stalking horse, effectively, for the deal. I'll take them for what it's worth. A couple of my friends that do most of the sponsor work are like, we are going to start doing more deals away. And I think I'll take them at their word. I think part of it is the pricing has contracted on these deals through the lenders because the risk profile isn't viewed as a real thing, or they're handicapping it. And I think I heard this from won't name the sponsor, but a very big sponsor that I had breakfast with last week, who said, I need to do a couple deals away just to put your clients back on their feet.
Right.
And so they understand that this is a real thing. And so I think they will. I still think it's the small minority of deals, but I think a couple of these sponsors are going to punch back just to try to reset the market a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. You mentioned Altice, so the European market. I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts as to how you see that market. It's, again, a massive question. How you see the market behaving. I assume there are barriers to entry, whether they've overcome, whether there will be more barriers to entry, but also more generally, when are these co-ops most effective, whether it's in a defensive, offensive scenario?
Right. In Europe, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Europe.
Well, I mean, generally speaking, Europe is one example that you mentioned that it just had to work.
Well, let's hit Europe. Europe's a different animal, and I've been experiencing that firsthand for the last 2 years. And by that I mean, and I've been saying this to clients over in Europe, and they kind of roll their eyes at me, at an event like this, when I say to them, LME is coming to your market. It's kind of like the ugly American, right? Go away. But in all seriousness, my theory behind that was same documents, half the time same sponsors, and now what you're seeing is same advisors. Now, I won't name any, but a lot of my friends that represent companies are pitching the same transactions and saying to the sponsors, I just recapitalized one of your businesses in the U.S. We took $500 million off the balance sheet. We got you new money. We extended your maturities, and you retained your equity. I don't know that they're going this far, but I think the pitch is you have a fiduciary obligation to your LPs to do these deals, right, to save their investment. I think that's resonating, and I can understand why. So I thought this was coming sooner. Altice was the first big one, although I have my own views as to whether or not that's truly an LME. I mean, we got a lot of equity upside for our discount. But I think it's coming. I think the main difference, two main differences. Cultural, there's just a resistance, good for them, by the way, to turning on one another. It's a smaller, tighter market. I mean, there's like 8 or 9 people in the lender market there that are in every deal. So I think it's a club, and it's very hard to break glass in that club. And the other is the local law overlay, depending on where you are. France, SFR, some of these transactions, like there's potential criminal liability. So it's a different corporate governance landscape. Germany, same thing. So I think that's a little bit numbs the ability to really do some of these very aggressive transactions that, as a lender lawyer, I would say boards of directors get away with in the U.S. In a fashion that you don't have that capability to do so in Europe. So we'll see. I think the market is gravitating more towards the U.S., but I don't think it's going to be any of the really ugly stuff that you see here, in the near distant future. It's around the edges.
I guess to follow up on that and a bit on what we were speaking earlier, the drawbacks of, obviously it's hard not to see the downsides of not organizing against aggressive LMEs, but the drawbacks are there too. I'm wondering if you just could quickly liquidity is one aspect of it. What are some of the more obvious ones?
Drawbacks of a co-op.
Of the co-op, yeah.
There are definitely drawbacks, don't get me wrong. Top ahead, right? So a lot of times people will put co-ops in place before you have any idea where the transaction's headed, because to your point, people organize early. And I have transactions now that lenders wanted a co-op a year ago, and here we are, one just printed today. Terrible results. Papers in the 40s. My biggest lenders can now do the same exact deal that my guys that own $2 million can do. It's not a great place for them to be. Right? There's an opportunistic deal for them to do with the sponsor that is pretty much off the table because of the co-op that's in place. So that leaves you in a place where the lender and the sponsor are kind of staring at each other because there's not a great solution for everyone. So there are drawbacks. One, I think, is removing optionality, because a co-op does remove optionality from a lender's perspective. Liquidity, I think, is less of an issue in the U.S. That was true 7 or 8 years ago. Okay. If you have a co-op with very high participation, sometimes it trades at a premium. Liquidity should be fine. If you try to put in place a 51% co-op because you're preserving the optionality, then liquidity becomes an issue. So, there are definitely drawbacks. I'm not.
Do you see a difference in co-op and non-co-op paper? Is that
in the market?
I could
I'm not a market maker, but I have one deal where we had a 51% co-op that leaked into the market, and there was a 25-point trading differential between co-op paper and non-co-op paper.
Makes sense. One element of this of LMEs and co-ops that you don't hear being discussed much is enforceability, and that's maybe because there's no need to talk about it, and maybe because so much is a function of reputational risk, and maybe because just the questions just aren't tested there in courts. How is this something that worries you, your clients? Is this something that the front
they're enforceable?
Yeah.
So, great question, because I was actually at a client this afternoon and literally raised the same question. Like, have these been tested yet?
Right.
The answer is, I've had a couple where we came very close. I had one recently where 2 of my lenders were arguably doing something outside of the spirit of the co-op, but it was a situation where they were going to refinance everyone out at par. So it was kind of like no harm, no foul. No one really cared. But it wasn't great. Look, from my perspective, no, there hasn't been a litigation yet in terms of enforceability. If you think about it, though, it's just a privity of contract. I have a contract with you. You've breached the contract by not agreeing, not abiding by the deal terms, not supporting the deal, or trying to cut your own deal on the side. And the way these things are set up is, in the first instance, there's a specific performance.
Right. I'd imagine that's tough.
Right. The idea is you're going to do this deal, or you're going to at least not oppose this deal. And then the backup is damages, right? Query, New York State, whether or not you get specific performance. It's a high bar, right? Worst case scenario, you're looking at damages. You got to prove damages. But I think you hit on the other point. I was just discussing this with a very large player on our market a couple hours ago, is the reputational issue. Like if you're, not going to pick on any clients, but if you're X fund and you sign a co-op and you just go out and breach that co-op, it's the last deal that these other guys are going to ever trust you in an ad hoc group. So we're all long-term players in the market, and I do think they are enforceable for what it's worth. It hasn't been tested. I'm not a judge. But I think in addition to that, there's just reputational risk that could really do harm to your future business in the market.
Okay, so I guess setting aside this interlender dynamics, borrowers and sponsors, on the other hand, aren't without tools. So there's restrictive NDAs out there. There's the current chatter about anti-co-op language, lengthy topics. We don't have a ton of time to get into all of them. But I guess I wonder if you see how you see this interplay between these measures and co-ops generally, and whether you think they're a response to each other, and just how cautious should lender be? What should they be particularly worried about when it comes to this communications with borrowers that happen pre-co-op formation?
Yeah. So the short version is it's cat and mouse game, right? Crappy documents led to co-ops. Co-ops, candidly, my answer is they're working, which is why you see sponsors taking these actions, whether it's a couple deals on the new issuance market this year where they tried to sneak in anti-co-op language, which luckily was caught. One of them we caught and got bounced out. The other thing I've seen is what you alluded to. I've had a couple deals, including one this weekend, where our principals were signing NDAs, and there was, provision 17 vague language. I'm like, basically saying you can't cooperate with other lenders, you can't work with other lenders, which to me is counterintuitive, because if you think about the way a term loan document works or an indenture works, term loan in particular, most actions you have to take as a group, as required lenders. You can't individually exercise remedies. You can't individually call a default. So the idea that you're going to put a provision that says, well, now you can't work together either, it doesn't jive. So, look, if you're your favorite company side law firm, what have you, their job is to go in and create options for sponsors, and they're very good at it, right? The co-op starts removing those options. So if you're on the other side of the table, all of these attempts to push anti-co-op language, sneaky NDAs, as I would call them, is to really try to open up the tool chest again from their vantage point. So the cat and mouse game will continue. Right? It's smart lawyers, smart bankers on both sides of the table.
I think we're just about out of time. I guess I'm not gonna ask you what you think of 2020, the rest of 2025 will look like, because I think the answer is it's just going to continue.
Be busy.
Right. But I do want to ask you, how do you today, you and your client, define success in this space, and whether there's something particularly challenging just at the time we're living today in the LME space?
Success is, it's a good question.
Right? It means different things for different parties.
If you think about it, right, all of these LME transactions, and maybe with the economic environment where it's headed, if we're really headed to a recession, we'll get back to good old restructurings. But they're sometimes capital structure fix. They're clearly a rejiggering of the deck chairs for the downside scenario. But none of them, frankly, fix the business. If there's a fundamental problem with the business, we're not addressing it. And so sometimes, you have commodity type businesses where you just need time for the prices to come back, and it works. Other retail, I don't think you fixed anything, right? And you're probably still going to end up in a bankruptcy or just delaying the inevitable. So I have a hard time viewing those as successes. I think just to be blunt about it, if you're the biggest guy and you rearrange the deck chairs and your 70-cent recovery just went to 90 cents because of the way you reshuffled the stack, that's probably a success from their vantage point. For me, a success, on the LME deals, put aside real restructurings, which is what I used to do, are the ones where we really get high participation. We get high take up. People come in. They may be ugly sometimes. I mean, we just closed Tropicana like 2 weeks ago. We had 100% of both the first lien and the second lien. That's success in my mind. And that was a tough transaction and a company that needed a lot of liquidity and a difficult sponsor. So that's success. In 2 years, if that thing's not performing, come back to me. Maybe not success.
Okay, well, that's a good way to end it, I think. I want to thank the Beard Group for organizing and inviting us at Bloomberg Intelligence to moderate. And also thank you so much, Scott, for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.